We are continuing with our fall sermon series this morning. Back to the Basics, Part 2, What do Presbyterians Believe About? And our topic this morning is money, or more specifically, what do Presbyterians believe about giving their money away? In our text for this morning, Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he is fundraising. He's holding up the Macedonian churches as an example for the Corinthian congregation to emulate as he seeks to gather an offering for the saints in Jerusalem. Listen now to Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth, chapter 8, verses 1 through 7. If you'd like to follow along in your pew Bibles, you may do so on page 941. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave, according to their means and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints. And this, not merely as we expected, they gave themselves first to the Lord and by the will of God to us, so that we might urge Titus, that as he had already made a beginning, so he should also complete this generous undertaking among you. Now, as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you, so we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. How many of you have noticed the beautiful stewardship campaign banners that are around the church right now? Outside the sanctuary, right over there, in the friendship court, a number of you have. And how many of you caught the word that is the campaign theme that is on the banners? Beyond. Beyond. That is our campaign theme this year, going beyond. What does it mean to go beyond? To go beyond what someone expects you to do, to go beyond what you are used to doing, or to have somebody go beyond for you. In their book, Practical Wisdom, psychologist Barry Schwartz and political scientist Kenneth Sharp tell a story about a hospital janitor named Luke. In the hospital where Luke worked, there was a young man who had gotten into a fight and was now in a coma. Each day, this young man's father sat by his bedside in silent vigil. He did it every day over the course of 6 months. One day, Luke came in and cleaned the young man's room as he normally did every day, only the young man's father was not in the room at that moment. He had gone out for a smoke. Later that day, Luke ran into the father in the hallway, and the father snapped at Luke. He accused him of not cleaning his son's room that day. Now, if that happened to you, what would you do? Would you snap back at the father and say, I did clean that room? Would you be very polite and say, I'm so sorry, sir, but I've already cleaned it? Luke did neither of those things. I cleaned the room again so he could see me cleaning it, Luke told somebody later on. I can understand how he can be. He'd be frustrated after all that time with his son in that condition. I guess I could understand. So I cleaned the room again. Now, what do you call that? You call it going beyond. Beyond what's expected of a person, beyond what's required of a person. And that is something that anyone in this room can do. It's what we hear about in our scripture from 2 Corinthians this morning. The Apostle Paul writes to the church in Corinth, holding up the churches of Macedonia as an example of generosity. Of those Macedonian churches, Paul says, during a severe ordeal of affliction, Their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. They voluntarily gave according to their means and even beyond their means. In other words, from the earliest days of the church, followers of Jesus have known what it means to go beyond. Now, I said a moment ago, our topic for today is what? Money. Good, money. What do Presbyterians believe about giving and sharing our money? And we'll get to that question. Don't forget about that question. But before we answer that question, I would like to explore a bit more with you what it means to go beyond. You see, Jesus was always asking his followers to go beyond. Do you remember the time that Jesus told the rich man who wanted to be his follower, sell everything you own, give the money to the poor, then come and follow me? He was asking that man to go beyond. Or maybe you remember the time that Jesus said, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Forgive not 7 times, but how many times? 8, 9, 70 times, or 7 times 7. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. What is Jesus doing here? He's telling his followers and his would-be followers, if you're going to follow me, you have to go beyond. Now, let me be the first to say that there is a part of me that does not like what Jesus just said, that does not like that part of Jesus in the least, a part of me that wants to draw a line in the sand and say, I am good right here, Jesus. Stop telling me to go beyond. Because when it comes to how I give my money and how I spend my time and who I have energy to love, Jesus, I'm doing okay. There's only so much I can do. I don't need you pushing me, Jesus, stretching me, Jesus, challenging me to do more than I already do, Jesus. I was having this conversation with Jesus in my office just this past week. And as I was having that conversation with Jesus in my office, I noticed on my desk a Westminster stewardship pamphlet. It was a pamphlet that Lee had found somewhere in the church when she was exploring some history about our church earlier this year. I know that you cannot see this pamphlet very clearly. It's from the year 1968. 1968. And do you know what the theme was that year? Within, around, and beyond. Open the pamphlet and it says, the challenge opens to you. Read a little more and it says, Westminster's 1969 program will cost 22% more than was pledged last year. Now, I don't know how that 1968 campaign turned out. I do know this. If it were not for those saints of Westminster from 55 years ago, I would not be standing before you today, and you would not be sitting there in your pew right now. The reason that any of us is here today is that someone who came before us was willing to go beyond. Have you ever seen someone go beyond before? It's a remarkable thing. A few months ago, I was standing in line at the grocery store waiting to pay for my groceries. It was a Sunday afternoon. Directly in front of me was an older gentleman. My guess is that he was in his 70s. I'm not really sure. He had on what looked to be church clothes, like he had just come to the grocery store right after leaving worship. Directly in front of him was a younger man. No idea how old he was. They were chatting a bit with each other. I assumed that they were relatives. Father and son, maybe grandfather and grandson. Hard to know for sure, but they were very friendly. Well, it took a bit of time for the younger man to pay, and I could not figure out what the holdup was. I started getting impatient. Finally, that younger gentleman left the line and left the store, and the older man pulled out his wallet to pay for his groceries. And the cashier told him to put his wallet away because the young man who had just left had paid for that older man's groceries. And the older gentleman was surprised. He was stunned. You could see it on his face. It became very clear very quickly that he had not known that young man who had just paid for his groceries. And he announced to anyone within hearing distance, "I guess Jesus has blessed me today." Two strangers at the grocery store. One of them looked at the other and decided to go beyond. Do you know what it's like to want to go beyond? Not resisting it like I was doing a couple minutes ago in this sermon with Jesus, but welcoming the opportunity, not because you have to do it, but because it's a joy to do it, because you cannot think of any other way of behaving in this world. You see, Presbyterians believe that there is something in each of us that is hardwired to go beyond. Why? Because each of us is created in the image of who? I'm going to give you another chance. Each of us is created in the image of who? God. Good, good. And is it in the character and nature of God to do the minimum amount required, to hold back, play it safe, be cautious in the face of fear? Is that what God is all about? No. God always goes beyond, showering us with more love than we can fathom, overwhelming us with grace we never saw coming. Going beyond is what you and I were created by God to do. And it is the theme of this year's stewardship campaign. What is one thing that everyone in this room can do in the coming year and in this campaign to go beyond? That's what we're asking every member of Westminster to consider. If you have never given to Westminster before, maybe the one thing you can do is make a pledge to Westminster this year. If every member who does not currently give were to give $75 each month, we would make our goal this year. Or if you've always pledged a particular amount every year, or a particular percentage of your income every year, what would happen if you stretched that amount, if you increased that percentage as a way of the one thing, doing the one thing to go beyond? Our pledge goal this year is $275,000 more than what was pledged last year. It's an 11% increase, and there are plenty of reasons that the session set that goal. One reason is that this is what we need to accomplish our goals of connecting, serving, growing in the ways that we believe God is calling us to grow. So the session unanimously said we need to ask the congregation for what we need. But there are other reasons as well. How many of you have noticed inflation in the world around us? Right. It hasn't just affected grocery stores, it's affected the operating costs of Westminster. At the same time, during the past 5 years, our church has grown in total membership by 300 members. That's like an additional congregation within our congregation compared to 5 years ago. 17% growth, and we need to staff, not only for those new members in that growth, but for future growth. At the same time, as a general rule of thumb, it takes about 3 new pledges to equal the amount of one pledge from someone who has recently died or someone who was here for years and years and years and recently moved. And in addition to all that, generosity remains one of the pillars of our church, and our session is committed to being generous with our neighbors in the world around us. All of these are good and faithful reasons for why we have the goal that we have this year. But from my point of view, there is another reason, the primary reason that we are asking everyone to go beyond. The primary reason is Jesus. As Presbyterians, we believe that going beyond leads us to Jesus. A number of years ago, I heard the story of a woman named Vera. Vera lived in Massachusetts, attended church there. She's a convert to the faith, did not grow up in a Christian home. Vera is originally from Cambodia. And as one might imagine, her life in Cambodia was much different than her life in the United States. In Cambodia, Vera had a wonderful and loving husband. But then came the days in the 1970s of the killing fields in the Khmer Rouge. When the Khmer Rouge took over, Vera and her husband were separated. He was sent to a work camp. While he was in the work camp, Vera became ill. Word got to him that his wife was sick, so he did something that, in Vera's words, was the most loving thing that has ever happened to me. At midnight one evening, her husband stole his commander's bike and rode for 3 hours in the darkness just to be with his wife so he could comfort her during her sickness for a bit. Then he rode back the 3 hours and put the bicycle back so that the commander would not notice it had been gone. Vera said that when her husband arrived in the middle of the night, his face was swollen with bee stings. Why bee stings? Because he had stopped at a beehive along the way to collect honey to give to his wife as a gift. When she was interviewed later in her life about how she came to the Christian faith, Vera said, "My husband died in that camp, and in my sorrow, someone told me the story of Jesus, and I recognized it. I had seen that kind of love before." Now, I realize we are not in Vera's shoes, but I bet if I asked each of you to think of a time when someone went beyond for you, when someone was there for you and walked with you and made a sacrifice for you, you would say it wasn't just that person that was there with you, it was Jesus. Jesus always going beyond for each of us. It's happened in this church before, not just back in 1968, but even more recently than that. Let me share a story with you that many of you will remember because you were here and present on that Sunday. I wasn't here yet, but many of you were, and I've heard this story from a number of you. It's about one of the saints of our church. She died just this past year, but about 6 years ago, shortly before I arrived at Westminster, it was Commitment Sunday. Everyone was coming forward during the final hymn with their pledge card. And she was getting on in years, and she lost her balance, and she fell. Walking up with her pledge card, she fell and she broke her hip at the end of worship. So there were plenty of people who came over to help her, and one of those was her neighbor. And she looked up and she recognized her neighbor's face. And flat on her back with a broken hip, do you know what she did? She took her pledge card and she shot her hand in the air to give it to her neighbor so that he could put it in the basket up front. Do you know what that's called? Going beyond. Going beyond what's expected, beyond what's required, going beyond is what she did out of love for this church. Now, I realize I have spent this entire sermon not directly answering the question, what do Presbyterians believe about money? But I hope you've already figured that answer out. We believe that what we do with our money is what we do with our lives. We give it away in love. Commitment Sunday is 2 weeks away, November 12th. I hope you will spend some time over the next 2 weeks considering the love that you have experienced in this church, and then thinking about the one thing you can do to go beyond. Amen.